and the space kind of became a Labour Party hub because, and partly it's a lot to do with space, I suppose, because with these co-housing communities, they have big rooms that you wouldn't have in a regular home. They have places to gather. So naturally, they can become cultural hubs for wider changes. And one thing that quite a few residents in Lilac said is that they probably wouldn't have gone out campaigning for the Labour Party if their neighbours weren't doing it. And when their neighbours did it, this kind of showed them how it was done, made it easy for them to try, and before they knew it, they were going out and campaigning too. I think it would be so. I think there are examples there of these communities being cultural hubs for the wider community. It would be interesting to try and measure a little bit more what impacts they have on their local communities. But generally speaking, they are pretty outward facing as communities go, I would say. And so there's no doubt that they can play quite an important role in enriching a local community, especially if they're actually really good and mindful to assess what is it that community needs, rather than what is it they want to project onto that community.
And another question that I have is, so here in Israel, for example, like back in the 60s and 70s, it was very famous to live in a kibbutz. And today, there is quite of harsh critique on like this kind of lifestyle, because it seemed that like um, when these communities are being created and they're kind of like separating themselves for the sake of building themselves as this like very utopian community of shared values and and shared interest, it also what created like um, this kind of like suddenly like the values of diversity. So suddenly it became really a luxury to become part of these communities, and that and and then this communities also became like very homogenous, so everyone kind of like coming from the same background or looking the same, or and I'm always like wondering, how where's the boundary supposed to pass so this won't become this kind of living, that suddenly they also decide like who can come in or who can go out, and
Yeah, totally. And I think this is a real issue with this type of living community where, to a certain extent, for the survival of the community or the harmony of the community, to a certain extent, there must be some like-mindedness, there must be some sharing of values. But like you say, when does this become, you know, being homogenous, being closed off to the perspectives of others? And the communities that I've worked with, um, people in them are pretty mindful of this kind of issue. These communities do tend to be pretty middle class. People are university educated. They You have to earn quite a lot of money quite often for meant to join many of these communities, so that kind of segregates people as well. And a lot of them do have quite long onboarding processes, so a long process where you spend a long time. Someone who wants to move in will spend a long time getting to know the community, and vice versa, the community spends time getting to know them. And the community does have a say in, well, they absolutely have a say in who's moving in. So several people might put in an offer that they want to move in, and the community will say, we're happy with these people, but we don't think that person quite fits in. And although, you know, I do believe that the people I've met are genuinely well intentioned in not wanting to exclude people who, for example, are working class or of a different ethnic background, or a different sexuality. Um, I guess because there is this long onboarding process. Say you are, someone from a working class background and you come into a group who are very nice, you'll get on well, but you just have very different perspectives. You come from different lives. Even if you like them very much, you just might not feel like you fit in. And they might feel the same about you. You're very nice, but somehow you don't fit in quite as easily as other people. So this kind of discrimination totally happens without people intending it to happen. And I think, honestly, I think it's an unresolved issue, and it is an issue in particular with co-housing communities. One potential light at the end of the tunnel is that I think with any kind of, new thing, whether it's housing or technology or anything else, you get early adopters who will make something a bit more aspirational. So one unusual thing about co-housing, for example, is that it makes a kind of shared living and shared housing aspirational. Many other types of shared living are seen as you're sharing through economic necessity. You're sharing because you have to, and as soon as you don't have to, you won't. So co-housing is perceived in this country as something aspirational to a certain group of people. And so hopefully as it's adopted by more and more people and becomes more mainstream, then it becomes more diverse, which is, that would be absolutely a positive thing. I think people in co-housing communities, as far as I understand, they are trying to be more diverse, but there's all these things acting against that as well. So I think it's still it's a valid criticism to be leveled at these types of communities, that they are not diverse enough.
Mm-hmm.
So
wow.
I have a question about everything that you've been touching upon, because there's something that kind of rubs me the wrong way about the topic, and this is the fact that what you're telling us about, it's because I grew up in a community in Chile. I grew up being brought up but it was out of necessity, what you talked about. So for me, co-housing and co-living being packaged in a new, being sold in a new package, and not accessible for all. It's just a new way of marketing it, and then you're making all the aspects that didn't work within lower socioeconomical classes are working here, but because there's more money to it. So I'm just do you understand where I'm coming from? I just want to hear your thoughts about the whole rebranding, this sort of thing, sort of what happened with food trucks, that were also that was a lower class thing, and now it's super hipster, and it's it has completely, I mean, it has been rebranded in a way. The same thing with thrift shops. Now they're cool, now they're trendy. When in reality, when I grew up, that was the only way to afford clothes.
Sure. Yeah.
Do you understand sort of where I'm coming from? Because
yeah.
I don't understand because every aspect that you've touched upon, the whole consensus, the being saving money, I mean, all of that, it's amazing. It's I mean, but it's not accessible for all. And the thing is that this is already happening in one way or another within lower socioeconomical areas around the world, countries, cities even. So I'm just curious about the rebranding and the marketing. It's a very good selling point, but just curious about that, if that has been a conscious choice, or what are your thoughts about that?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, no, it's a really, really good point you're making, and I'm glad that you brought it up. So I think one thing about shared living and sharing in general is that I guess to make a slight generalization, sharing is only a joy if you choose to share. If you're forced to share, maybe you can find joy in it, but it's not the same thing. Choosing to share is not the same thing as having to share. And yeah, I think as someone in conscious co-living who works with co-living operators and developers, there is certainly this element that co-living is this new trend, and we're dressing up flat sharing as something that people were doing anyway and have been doing a long time anyway. So it's just a trend being sold to people who have some disposable income. Like, I totally see that does happen, and it can be the case. But what I think is different about shared living communities is the intentionality. And that, again, I guess that goes back to that concept of sharing is only joyful if you choose to share. Behind, I think the need that lies behind shared living really is loneliness. And in the UK, certainly, we have a lot of issues with loneliness. We have more and more people living by themselves. We have people moving to cities to get a new job, so they're far away from their social networks. And I think that is what has prompted this renewed interest in shared living, that people are suddenly recognizing that actually, if I have disposable income, it's not really going to benefit my well-being to spend it on a big house. Actually, what's better for my happiness and my well-being is to live with a group of people who I feel connection with and who I can share some aspects of my life with. And I agree with the criticism that some of these things are inaccessible for many people. So co-housing, finding a community of people and building, buildings together to have your community, it's inaccessible for most people. But I would argue that something like co-living, a more intentional form of flat sharing, is accessible for anybody and is more economical. So if you have a flat share with people who you get along with very well, if you make a decision, so like some of the co-living communities I've visited, one was a flat share of people who were a little bit older, in between sort of mid-30s, early 40s, and they basically made the decision that they wanted to live together as adults, not with the sort of atmosphere of a student halls, but as adults in a really nice flat share. And what they did was they took it in turns to cook meals every evening. So they cooked once a week, but they had really nice food every night of the week. They took it in turns to clean. That meant they did less cleaning. They had social events a couple of days a week. So they kind of socialized with each other and got to know each other very well. And that, in their situation, that was a more accessible and more affordable way to live. And it was more about the intentionality and the social structures they created, rather than being able to afford a certain space. So yeah, co-housing is true. It's inaccessible at this point. And partly I'm an advocate for it because I hope it will become more accessible over time. But also there are forms of shared living where you're choosing to live intentionally that I think can be accessible to many different groups of people.
I put 2 links in the chat. The Swedish Theory of Love. I recommend everybody to watch it. It's about Swedish single households, because Sweden is quite unique in the world, and yeah, with single households, and they link it to mental health.
Thank you so much, Pierre, for sharing this. Unfortunately, I will need to cut it here because our next speaker is already in. So if you need any break, please feel free to take some 5 minutes break. Penny, thank you so much for your time and for this interesting lecture. It was fascinating.
Thank you. Real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
So there